Hi, and welcome back to another podcast on the saga of Darren and Cirque du Freak, A Living Nightmare. Just before we continue reading, I wanted to just look back at the final two sentences in chapter 10 before we move on to chapter 11 and see if we can make a prediction based on those two sentences. So I'll read it again. When Ramos left the stage, I thought nobody could top such an act. I was wrong. Okay, so the final sentence, I was wrong, ends with an exclamation mark, suggesting a sense of excitement and the fact that he's questioning his initial response to the circus. So what can you predict from the last two lines about the next few performances? Have a go, pause it, have a go, and then think about after listening to the reading of the next few chapters, whether your prediction was right. Right, chapter 11. A couple of people in the blue hooded robes came around after Ramos Two Bellies, selling gifts. There was some really cool stuff, like chocolate models of the nuts and bolts that Ramos ate, and rubber dolls of Alexander ribs, which you could bend and stretch. And there were clippings of the wolfman's hair. I bought a bit of that. It was tough and wiry, sharp as a knife. There will be more novelties later, Mr. Tall announced from the stage, so don't spend all your money right away. How much is the glass statue? Steve asked. It was the same sort that Ramos Two Bellies had eaten. The person in the blue hood didn't say anything, but stuck out a sign with the price on. I can't read, Steve said. Will you tell me how much it costs? I stared at Steve and wondered why he was lying. The person in the hood still didn't speak. This time he, or she, shook his head quickly and moved on before Steve could ask anything else. What was that about? I asked. Steve shrugged. I wanted to hear it speak, he said, to see if it was human or not. Of course it's human, I said. What else could it be? I don't know, he said. That's why I was asking. Don't you think it's strange that they keep their faces covered all the time? Maybe they're shy, I said. Maybe, he said, but I could tell he didn't believe that. When the people selling the gifts were finished, the next freak came on. It was the bearded lady, and at first I thought it was meant to be a joke, because she didn't have a beard. Mr. Tall stood behind her and said, Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very special act. Truska here is new to our family. She is one of the most incredible performers I have ever seen, with a truly unique talent. Mr. Tall walked off. Truska was very beautiful, dressed in flowing red robes which had made many slashes and gaps. Lots of the men in the theatre began to cough and shift around in their seats. Truska stepped closer to the edge of the stage so we could see her better. Then she said something that sounded like a seal barking. She put her hands on her face, one at either side, and stroked the skin gently. Then she held her nose shut with two fingers and tickled her chin with her other hand. An extraordinary thing happened. She began to grow a beard. Hairs crept out, first on her chin, then on her upper lip, then the sides of her face, finally all over. It was long and blonde and straight. It grew about 10 or 11 centimetres, then stopped. She took her fingers away from her nose and stepped down into the crowd, where she walked around and let people pull on the beard and stroke it. The beard continued growing as she walked until finally it reached down to her feet. When she arrived at the rear of the theatre, she turned and walked back to the stage. Even though there was no breeze in here, her hair blew about wildly, tickling people's faces as she passed. When she was back on the stage, Mr. Tall asked if anybody had a pair of scissors. Lots of women did. Mr. Tall invited a few up. The Cirque du Freak will give 1 solid bar of gold to anyone who can slice off Truska's beard, he said, and held up a small yellow ingo to show he wasn't joking. That got a lot of people excited, and for 10 minutes nearly everybody in the theatre tried cutting off her beard, but they couldn't. Nothing could cut through the bearded lady's hair, not even a pair of garden shears which Mr. Tall handed out. The funny thing was, it still felt soft, just like ordinary hair. When everyone had admitted defeat, Mr. Tall emptied the stage and Truska stood in the middle again. She stroked her cheeks as before and held her nose, but this time the beard grew back in. It took about 2 minutes for the hairs to disappear back inside, and then she looked exactly as she had when she first came out. She left to huge applause, and the next act came on almost directly after her. His name was Hans Hands. He began by telling us about his father who'd been born without legs. Hans's father learned to get around on his hands just as well as other people could on their feet, and had taught his children his secrets. Hans then sat down, pulled up his legs and wrapped his feet around his neck. He stood on his hands, walked up and down the stage, then hopped off and challenged 4 men, picked at random, to a race. They could race on their feet, he'd race on his hands. He promised a bar of gold to anyone who could beat him. They used the aisles of the theatre as a racetrack, and despite his disadvantage, Hans beat the 4 men easily. He claimed he could sprint 100 metres in 80 seconds on his hands, and nobody in the theatre doubted him. Afterwards, he performed some impressive gymnastic feats, proving that a person could manage just as well without legs as with them. His act wasn't especially exciting, but it was enjoyable. There was a short pause after Hans had left, when Mr. Tall came on. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "our next act is another unique and perplexing one. It can also be quite dangerous, so I ask that you make no noise and do not clap until you are told it is safe." The whole place went quiet. After what had happened with the Wolfman earlier, nobody needed telling twice. When it was quiet enough, Mr. Tall walked off the stage. He shouted out the name of the next freak as he went, but it was a soft shout. "Mr. Krepsley and Madame Octa." The lights went down low and a creepy-looking man walked onto the stage. He was tall and thin, with very white skin and only a small crop of orange hair on the top of his head. He had a large scar running down his left cheek. It reached to his lips and made it look like his mouth was stretching up the side of his face. He was dressed in dark red clothes and carried a small wooden cage, which he put on a table. When he was set, he turned and faced us. He bowed and smiled. He looked even scarier when he smiled, like a crazy clown in a horror movie I once saw. Then he started to explain about the act. I missed the first part of his speech because I wasn't looking at the stage. I was watching Steve. You see, when Mr. Krepsley walked out, there had been total silence, except for one person who had gasped loudly. Steve. I stared curiously at my friend. He was almost as white as Mr. Krepsley and was shaking all over. He'd even dropped the rubber model of Alexander Ribs that he'd bought. His eyes were fixed on Mr. Krepsley, as though glued to him, and as I watched him watch the freak, the thought which crossed my mind was, he looks like he's seen a ghost. Chapter 12. "It is not true that all tarantulas are poisonous," Mr. Krepsley said. He had a deep voice. I managed to tear my eyes away from Steve and train them on the stage. Most are as harmless as the spiders you find anywhere in the world, and those which are poisonous normally only have enough poison in them to kill very small creatures. But some are deadly, he went on. Some can kill a man with one bite. They are rare and only found in extremely remote areas, but they do exist. I have one such spider, he said, and opened the door of the cage. For a few seconds nothing happened, but then the largest spider I had ever seen crawled out. It was green and purple and red, with long hairy legs and a big fat body. I wasn't afraid of the spiders, but this one looked terrifying. The spider walked forward slowly. Then its legs bent and it lowered its body as though waiting for a fly. Madame Octa has been with me for several years, Mr. Krepsley said. She lives far longer than ordinary spiders. The monk who sold her to me said some of her kind lived to be 20 or 30 years old. She is an extraordinary creature, but poisonous and intelligent. While he was speaking, one of the blue-hooded people led a goat onto the stage. It was making a frightened, bleating noise and kept trying to run. The hooded person tied it to the table and left. The spider began moving when it saw and heard the goat. It crept to the edge of the table where it stopped as if waiting an order. Mr. Krepsley produced a shiny tin whistle. He called it a flute. From his tiny trouser pocket and blew a few short notes. Madame Octa immediately leaped through the air and landed on the goat's neck. The goat gave a leap when the spider landed and began bleating loudly. Madame Octa took no notice, hung on and moved a few centimetres closer to the head. When she was ready, she bared her fangs and sunk them deep into the goat's neck. The goat froze and its eyes went wide. It stopped bleating and a few seconds later toppled over. I thought it was dead, but then realised it was still breathing. This flute is how I control Madame Octa, Mr. Krepsley said, and I looked away from the fallen goat. He waved the flute slowly above his head. Though we have been together such a long time, she is not a pet, and would surely kill me if I ever lost it. The goat is paralysed, he said. I have trained Madame Octa not to kill outright with her first bite. The goat would die in the end if we left it. There is no cure for Madame Octa's bite, but we shall finish it quickly. He blew on the flute and Madame Octa moved up the goat's neck until she was standing in its ear. She bared her fangs again and bit. The goat shivered, then went totally still. It was dead. Madame Octa dropped from the goat and crawled towards the front of the stage. The people in the front rows became very alarmed and some jumped to their feet, but they froze at a short command from Mr. Krepsley. "Do not move," he hissed. "Remember your earlier warning, a sudden noise could mean death." Madame Octa stopped at the edge of the stage, then stood on her two back legs, the same as a dog. Mr. Krepsley blew softly on his flute and she began walking backwards, still on 2 feet. When she reached the nearest leg of the table, she turned and climbed up. "You will be safe now," Mr. Krepsley said, and the people in the front rows sat down again, as slowly and quietly as they could. "But please," he added, "do not make any loud noises, because if you do, she might come after me." I don't know if Mr. Krepsley was really scared, or if it was part of the act, but he looked frightened. He wiped the sleeve of his right arm over his forehead and then placed the flute back in his mouth and whistled a strange little tune. Madame Octa cocked her head, then appeared to nod. She crawled across the table until she was in front of Mr. Krepsley. He lowered his right hand and she crept up his arm. The thought of those long hairy legs creeping along his flesh made me sweat all over, and I liked spiders. People who were afraid of them must have been nervously chewing the insides of their cheeks to pieces. When she got to the top of his arm, he scuttled along his shoulder, up his neck, over his ear, and didn't stop until she reached the top of his head, where she lowered her body. She looked like a funny sort of a hat. After a while, Mr. Krepsley began playing the flute again. Madame Octa slid down and the other side of his face along the scar and walked around until she was standing upside down on his chin. Then she spun a string of web and dropped down on it. She was hanging about 10 centimeters below his chin now and slowly began rocking from side to side. Soon she was swinging about level with his ears. Her legs were tucked in, and from where I was sitting she looked like a ball of wool. Then, as she made an upward swing, Mr. Krepsley threw his head back and she went flying straight up into the air. The thread snapped and she tumbled around and around. I watched her go up, then come down. I thought she'd land on the floor or the table, but she didn't. Instead, she landed in Mr. Krepsley's mouth. I nearly got sick when I thought of Madame Octa sliding down his throat and into his belly. I was sure she'd bite him and kill him, but the spider was a lot smarter than I knew. As she was falling, she'd stuck her legs out and they had caught on his lips. He brought his head forward so we could see his face. His mouth was wide open and Madame Octa was hanging between his lips. Her body throbbed in and out of his mouth and she looked like a balloon which he was blowing up and letting the air out of. I wondered where the flute was and how he was going to control the spider now. Then Mr. Tall appeared with another flute. He couldn't play as well as Mr. Krepsley, but he was good enough to make Madame Octa take notice. She listened, then moved from one side of Mr. Krepsley's mouth to the other. I didn't know what she was doing at first, so I craned my neck to see. When I saw the bits of white on Mr. Krepsley's lips, I understood. She was spinning a web. When she was finished, she lowered herself from his chin like she had before. There was a large web spun across Mr. Krepsley's mouth. He began chewing and licking the web. He ate the whole of it, then rubbed his belly, being careful not to hit Madame Octa, and said, "Delicious. Nothing tastier than fresh spider webs. They are a treat where I come from." He made Madame Octa push a ball across the table, then got her to balance on top of it. He set up small pieces of gym gear, tiny weights and ropes and rings, and put her through her paces. She was able to do all the things a human could, like lift weights above her head and climb ropes and pull herself up on the rings. Then he brought out a tiny dinner set. There were mini plates and knives and forks and teeny weeny glasses. The plates were filled with dead flies and other small insects. I don't know what was in the glasses. Madame Octa ate that dinner as neatly as you please. She was able to pick up the knives and forks 4 at a time and feed herself. There was even a fake salt cellar which she sprinkled over one of the dishes. It was round about the time she was drinking from the glass that I decided Madame Octa was the world's most amazing pet. I would have given everything I owned for her. I knew it could never be. Mum and Dad wouldn't let me keep her even if I could buy her, but that didn't stop me from wishing. When the act was over, Mr. Krepsley put the spider back in her cage and bowed low while everybody clapped. I heard a lot of people saying it wasn't fair to have killed the poor goat, but it had been thrilling. I turned to Steve to tell him how great I thought the spider was, but he was watching Mr. Krepsley. He didn't look scared anymore, but he didn't look normal either. "Steve, what's wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer. "Steve, shh," he snapped and wouldn't say another word until Mr. Krepsley had left. He watched the odd-looking man walk back to the wings. Then he turned to me and gasped, "This is amazing." "The spider?" I asked. "It was great. How do you think?" "I'm not talking about the spider," he snapped. "Who cares about a silly old arachnid? I'm talking about Mr. Krepsley." He paused before saying the man's name, as though he'd been about to call him something different. "Mr. Krepsley?" I asked, confused. What was so great about him? All he did was play the flute. "You don't understand," Steve said angrily. "You don't know who he really is." "And you do?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "As a matter of fact, I do." He rubbed his chin and started looking worried again. I just hope he doesn't know I know. If he does, we might never make it out of here alive. Right, so I'm just going to pause there with the reading. So we've read 2 chapters, 11 and 12, and we have seen a few more performers. We've seen Truska, the bearded lady, and how amazing her performance was. We saw Hans Hand, who walks on his hands, okay, and how he was able to beat some of the people who had come to watch, who were using their feet, showing that, you know, extraordinary things can happen. And then finally, we meet Mr. Krepsley and Madame Octa. The description that the writer uses in describing him sounded a little bit like some of the words that I used when I was describing the front cover. If you remember, in one of the first few parts, we talked about a man with with orange hair, with a scar down one eye, and with a humongous spider in his palm. This is the character. It is Mr. Krepsley, and Madame Octa is the spider. Okay, so what I want you to do is just to pause for a few moments and have a think about any adjectives to describe either of these characters. So what words and phrases would you use to describe Mr. Krepsley and Madame Octa? Can you try and think about maybe 5 adjectives for each character? And then we'll have a quick look at that final sentence, or final 2 or 3 sentences in terms of a prediction in a few minutes. Okay, so just pause now and have a think about your adjectives to describe both of those characters.